Okay, so you want to buy a hospital, acquire a building full of doctors, charge people to get better, and collect from insurance companies on the way out. Here's what the business looks like before the first patient walks through the door. The average American hospital operates on a net margin of roughly 2 to 3% in a good year. A grocery store does better. A parking garage does better. And unlike a parking garage, a hospital cannot lock its doors when the numbers don't work because federal law requires it to treat anyone who shows up in an emergency regardless of their ability to pay. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the most powerful hospitals in the country pay zero in federal income tax and still generate hundreds of millions in annual surplus. How a hospital prices the same appendectomy at 11 different dollar amounts depending on who's asking. Why the states that make it hardest to build a new hospital are often the states where existing hospitals are the most profitable, and what happened when a private equity firm decided to run one of the oldest teaching hospitals in America the same way it would run a chain of dry cleaners. Hospitals come in three structures, and the structure determines almost everything about how the money moves. A critical access hospital is the smallest recognized category under federal law. These are rural facilities with no more than 25 inpatient beds, located at least 35 miles from the nearest hospital. There are roughly 1,350 of them operating in the United States. They receive cost-based Medicare reimbursement, meaning Medicare pays them 101% of their allowable costs rather than the flat diagnostic rates paid to larger facilities. The federal government designed this intentionally. Without the cost-plus structure, most of these hospitals would have closed decades ago because the patient volume is too low and the payer mix too poor to sustain a conventionally priced facility. They are kept alive by a deliberate policy decision, not by market economics. A community hospital, the most common type, operates between 50 and 400 beds. These are the facilities that serve most American cities and suburbs. They range from independent nonprofit operations anchored to a single county to regional systems with 5 or 6 campuses consolidated under one tax-exempt corporate structure. The nonprofit designation is the critical structural fact about this tier. Roughly 58% of all community hospitals in the United States are registered as 501c3 nonprofit organizations. They pay no federal income tax. They pay no state or local property tax in most jurisdictions. They issue tax-exempt municipal bonds at lower interest rates than for-profit competitors. And in exchange for all of that, they are required to provide something the IRS calls community benefit, which is a category broad enough to include charity care, medical education, research, and, until a 2019 rule tightened the definition, hospital executive compensation in some accounting frameworks. An academic medical center is a different business entirely. Facilities like the Cleveland Clinic, Massachusetts General, or New York Presbyterian are not primarily organized around treating sick people in the conventional service business sense. They are organized around 3 simultaneous missions: patient care, graduate medical education, and research, and each of those missions has its own separate funding stream. Medicare pays academic medical centers an additional per-resident amount on top of its standard rates specifically to fund physician training. The National Institutes of Health and private foundations fund the research operation, and the clinical enterprise, the actual patient care, cross-subsidizes both. The largest of these systems report annual revenues exceeding $5 billion. They operate more like complex quasi-governmental institutions than businesses, and the people who run them are rewarded accordingly. The CEO of a major academic medical center typically earns between $2 million and $5 million a year. Here's the cost nobody budgets for at the start: the certificate of need. 35 states currently require any entity wishing to build a new hospital, add inpatient beds, or purchase major equipment like an MRI machine above a certain dollar threshold to first obtain government approval in a process called a Certificate of Need Review. The applicant must demonstrate to a state regulatory board that the community requires the new capacity and that the existing hospital market cannot absorb it. The process typically takes 1 to 3 years. Existing hospitals are legally permitted to challenge applications from competitors during the review. The result, in many cases, is that a nonprofit hospital system with significant resources and existing political relationships can effectively block a new entrant from entering the market at all by participating in the challenge process. The economic literature on certificate of need laws is not ambiguous. States that maintain them have higher hospital prices on average than states that have repealed them. The regulation was designed to prevent duplication of expensive services. Its primary effect in practice has been to protect market incumbents from competition. And that incumbency connects directly to the second hidden cost, the payer mix. A hospital does not have one price. It has a charge master, an internal list of tens of thousands of line items representing the nominal price for every billable service. The charge master price for a standard appendectomy might be $60,000. Medicare will pay $15,000 for that procedure. A major commercial insurer with significant negotiating leverage might pay $22,000. A smaller insurer with less leverage might pay $35,000. And an uninsured patient who receives a bill at chargemaster rates and has no negotiating position could theoretically be billed the full $60,000. Though federal and state surprise billing protections have significantly constrained this practice since 2022, the same procedure performed on the same patient in the same operating room generates a completely different revenue figure depending on who is paying for it. This means a hospital's financial performance is determined less by how efficiently it delivers care and more by what percentage of its patients are covered by which payers. Medicare pays less than commercial insurance. Medicaid pays less than Medicare. Uninsured patients pay least of all or nothing. A hospital in an affluent suburban market where a high proportion of patients carry commercial insurance will generate significantly more revenue per patient than an identical facility in a low-income urban market, serving predominantly Medicaid patients. Even if both facilities deliver care at the same quality level, you do not choose your payer mix. It is determined by the demographics of the community that shows up at your door. 4 revenue mechanisms sustain the business beyond the basic service fee. Mechanism 1. The 340B drug pricing program. Nonprofit hospitals that meet federal eligibility criteria can purchase outpatient drugs from pharmaceutical manufacturers at steep discounts, sometimes 25 to 50% below the standard wholesale price, and then bill insurance companies and patients at the full standard rate. The margin between acquisition cost and billing rate is kept by the hospital. The program was created in 1992 to help safety net providers stretch their pharmaceutical budgets. It has since expanded to the point where 340B drugs represent billions of dollars annually in margin for large health systems, many of which are not safety net providers in any meaningful sense. In 2022, the Health Resources and Services Administration estimated that 340B purchases exceeded $44 billion in total drug spending. Mechanism 2. Employed physician revenue. Hospitals now directly employ approximately 75% of physicians in the United States, a figure that has more than doubled in the past 15 years. Employed physicians generate facility fees on top of professional fees for services rendered in a hospital outpatient department, fees that do not apply when the same service is delivered in an independent physician's office. A patient seeing a cardiologist employed by a hospital system and seeing an identical cardiologist in an independent practice will receive 2 different bills for the same appointment. The hospital collects the facility fee in the first case. No one collects it in the second. Hospital acquisition of physician practices has been, in large part, a mechanism for converting non-hospital revenue into hospital revenue. Mechanism 3. Outpatient volume growth. Inpatient admissions have been declining for decades as procedures that once required overnight stays are now performed and recovered from on an ambulatory basis. Hospitals have responded by aggressively expanding outpatient services, surgery centers, imaging centers, infusion clinics, and rehabilitation facilities, which can be operated at lower overhead than inpatient beds while still generating facility fee revenue. The largest hospital systems now derive more than half their total revenue from outpatient services. Mechanism 4. Investment income. Large nonprofit hospital systems hold substantial investment portfolios funded by their accumulated surpluses and philanthropic endowments. In years with strong financial markets, investment income can represent a significant share of total revenue. The Cleveland Clinic reported investment income exceeding $700 million in fiscal year 2021. This income is tax-exempt for nonprofit systems, compounding the structural advantage of the nonprofit designation. Here's the part that explains why this business destroys people who approach it without understanding the structural constraints. Two risks sit underneath every hospital acquisition, regardless of size. Risk 1, the labor market is not elastic. Nursing shortages are structural, not cyclical. A registered nurse with specialty training in a cardiac ICU cannot be replaced in 90 days, regardless of what wages are offered. During the pandemic, hospitals that lost staffing to travel nursing agencies found themselves paying $150 to $200 per hour for contract nurses, performing the same functions as staff nurses earning $40 per hour. The difference came directly out of operating margin. For many community hospitals, labor represents 55 to 65% of total operating costs. There is no supply chain optimization that offsets a 40% increase in nursing labor costs. You cannot substitute technology for a bedside nurse in an ICU in the time frame that matters for a fiscal year budget. Risk 2, capital obsolescence never stops. A hospital opened 30 years ago has electrical systems, plumbing, HVAC, and structural configurations that may be incompatible with current infection control standards, electronic health record infrastructure, or imaging equipment weight loads. Replacing a single MRI machine costs between $1 million and $3 million plus installation. Rebuilding a surgical suite runs $3 million to $10 million per operating room. And unlike a zoo enclosure renovation, there is no committee that can grant you a timeline extension because delaying infrastructure creates patient safety liability. A hospital is always in the middle of a capital project that was supposed to have finished last year. Two scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1. A 180-bed independent community nonprofit hospital in a mid-sized Midwestern city. Payer mix skewed toward Medicare and Medicaid, with commercial insurance representing roughly 30% of volume. Annual revenue around $280 million. Operating costs, driven by labor and supply chain, around $275 million. Net operating margin under 2% in a good year, meaning surplus of $4 million to $6 million that goes directly back into deferred capital and quality programs. In a bad year, a labor contract renegotiation or a drop in elective surgical volume puts the hospital into operating deficit. The board then faces a choice between taking on debt, deferring capital, or beginning conversations with a larger regional system about acquisition. Most independent community hospitals of this profile have had this conversation at least once in the last decade. Roughly 140 rural hospitals have closed entirely since 2010. Scenario 2. A large regional nonprofit hospital system, 6 campuses, 1,400 licensed beds, significant outpatient infrastructure, an employed physician group of 800 practitioners, annual revenue around $3.2 billion, operating surplus around $160 million, roughly 5% margin, which the system describes in its annual report as reinvestment in community health. The system holds a bond-funded capital program of $800 million over 10 years for facility modernization. It pays no property tax on real estate, assessed at over $1 billion. Its CEO earns $4.3 million. Its 990 filing, the public tax document nonprofit organizations are required to submit, is 200 pages long and available on ProPublica's Nonprofit Explorer for anyone interested in reading it. The business is very good. The community benefit requirement is met primarily through Medicare and Medicaid shortfall accounting, which counts the gap between what Medicare pays and what the hospital charges at list price as charity. In 2019, Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia closed its doors after 171 years of continuous operation. Hahnemann was an academic teaching hospital, one of the few safety net institutions in a major American city providing care to a predominantly low-income and uninsured patient population. In 2018, it was acquired by American Academic Health System, a company backed by a private equity investor named Joel Friedman. Friedman paid $170 million for the hospital and the attached medical school. What he was primarily interested in was not the hospital, it was the real estate, a 496,000 square foot building in central Philadelphia that could be converted to luxury condominiums if the medical operation could be wound down. Within a year of the acquisition, the hospital had failed to make payroll on multiple occasions. Suppliers were going unpaid. Nursing staff was being reduced. In June 2019, Friedman filed for bankruptcy and announced the hospital would close. Roughly 2,500 employees lost their jobs. Approximately 50,000 patients lost their primary care and specialty relationships. The medical residency programs were dispersed to other institutions on emergency orders from the state. The real estate was eventually sold for $60 million. A bankruptcy trustee spent 3 years pursuing Friedman for breach of fiduciary duty. The building still sits largely vacant. That is the actual economics of buying a hospital. It is not a business about medicine. It is a business about who controls a piece of infrastructure that a community cannot survive without, and whether the entity that controls it has obligations to that community that supersede its obligation to return capital. The 2% operating margin is not a flaw in the model. It is a structural feature of an institution that cannot turn away patients, cannot lay off its nursing staff between busy seasons, and cannot defer the capital cycle. The nonprofit designation is not generosity. It is a regulatory compact that trades tax exemption for a community benefit obligation that is, depending on who is doing the accounting, either a serious constraint or a very flexible reporting category. Buy into this business as a real estate play, and you will find out, as one investor did in the middle of a city of 1.5 million people, exactly how fast a federal bankruptcy court and a state attorney general become involved once 50,000 patients have nowhere to go. You don't buy a hospital. You inherit every obligation it has ever made to every patient who has ever walked through its door. And those obligations do not appear on any balance sheet you will be shown before you sign.